Hello, everyone. I am saying hello to the people who are supposed to join the stream. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. I will cut this off. Let me start again. Hello. I'm saying hello to the people who are supposed to join the stream and to the people who are watching this in the recording, like always, just like always. Today we're doing another read aloud of The Hobbit. So last time we finished in Mirkwood already with Thorin captured. And today we're going further into the Elves' Kingdom, which is why we can see the illustration of the Elven Kingdom, Elven King's Gate or whatever it's called. Hello, hi! I'm very glad to see you joined our reading today. And yeah, that's why we see the illustration instead of the map. I think everybody knows where we are in terms of the maps now. And like always, the artist for today is still Buhanki, whose Telegram channel you can see as the link and in the description, and whose wonderful bimbo baggins you can see right now on screen. Last time we finished with Thorin captured, and he was just hilarious. I am a Tolkien fan, yes, to answer your question, but I'm not as big now. Oh, which is, I forgot to mention, yes, I will be making pronunciation mistakes because this is not an audiobook. This is just a fun, let's read together experience. I used to be a bigger Tolkien fan, I think. Like 10 years ago, maybe. Ooh, modernity. I'm not sure what modern works I've actually read that I can call myself a fan of. I read The Uglies this year, or last year maybe, and that was probably my only touch with modern literature in 10 years, really. Because the last time I read something modern was when I was a teenager, which is about the same time when I was a Tolkien fan. Fantastically. Anyway, right, last time Thorin told King Thranduil that they were starving, that he was in the woods because they wanted to find food. And that was a hilarious dialogue. I wish they kept it in the movies. Stormlight Archives and The Name of the Wind. Oh, I have never heard of those. What kind of genre are they, actually? I don't even know. I finished a really great fanfic today while I wait for you to describe the books. It was another modern girl in Middle Earth. I wouldn't call myself a fan of modern girl in Middle Earth, but I like to read them once in a while. If you've heard of O Sanova, it was just amazing. It is like 2 books long, like 1,200 pages, 300,000 words over that. And that was fantastic. Jesus Christ, do I want to just live in that fanfic ever and ever. That was wonderful. High fantasy. Oh, okay. Well, maybe I should actually take a note of that, of those two. Let me quickly bookmark those names. Thank you for the recommendation. I will probably only get around to reading those after I finish this read aloud of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings later, but what do you know? I will probably read that, maybe even aloud, if you wish. Anyway, so let's start today with the next chapter, the next Mirkwood chapter, which is chapter 9, Barrels Out of Bond. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst. They got up and staggered on in the direction which 8 of the 13 of them guessed to be the one in which the bath lay, but they never found out if they were right. Such day as there ever was in the forest was fading once more into the blackness of night, when suddenly out sprang the light of many torches all round them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leaped the wood elves with their bows and spears, and called the dwarves to halt. There was no thought of a fight, even if the dwarves had not been in such a state that they were actually glad to be captured. Their small knives, the only weapons they had, would have been of no use against the arrows of the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark, so they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited. All except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why, when the elves bound the dwarves in a long line, one behind the other, and counted them, they never found or counted the Hobbit. Nor did they hear or feel him trotting along well behind their torchlight as they led off their prisoners into the forest. Each dwarf was blindfolded, but that did not make much difference, for even Bilbo, with the use of his eyes, could not see where they were going, and neither he nor the others knew where they had started from anyway. Bilbo had all he could do to keep up with the torches, for the elves were making the dwarves go as fast as they could, sick and weary as they were. The king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly the torches stopped, and the hobbit had just time to catch them before they began to cross the bridge. This was the bridge that led across the river to the king's doors. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and at the far end were gates before the mouth of a huge cave that ran into the side of a steep slope covered with trees. Is this correct? Yes, that should be nice. There the great beeches came right down to the bank till their feet were in the stream. Across the bridge the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and he only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over the heels of the last elves before the great gates of the king closed behind them with a clang. Inside, the passages were lit with red torchlight, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisting, crossing, and echoing paths. These were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with a cleaner air. In a great hall with pillars hewn out of the living stone sat the elven king on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand he held a carven staff of oak. This is the illustration again. So, the prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes in here, said he. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who once brought inside. Long and searchingly he questioned the dwarves about their doings, and where they were going to, and where they were coming from, but he got little more news out of them than out of Thorin. They were surly and angry, and did not even pretend to be polite. "What have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "Is it a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, or to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry?" Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, "It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue and trouble my people in the forest, and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right to know what brings you here, and if you will not let me now, tell me now, I will keep you all in prison until you have learnt sense and manners." Then he ordered the dwarves each to be put in a separate cell, and to be given food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prisons until one at least of them was willing to tell him all he wanted to know. But he did not tell them that Thorin was also a prisoner with him. It was Bilbo who found that out. Poor Mr. Baggins. It was a very long time that he lived in that place all alone, and always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remotest corners he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elven King's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of the wood elves, sometimes with the king at their head, would from time to time ride out to hunt or to other business in the woods and in the lands to the east. Then if Bilbo was very nimble, he could slip out just behind them, though it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once he was nearly caught in the doors as they clashed together when the last elf passed, yet he did not dare to march among them because of his shadow, altogether thin and wobbly as it was in torchlight, or for fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good. He did not wish to desert the dwarves, and indeed he did not know where in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time they were out, so he never discovered the ways out of the wood, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrified of losing himself until a chance came of returning. He was hungry, too, outside, for he was no hunter, but inside the caves he could pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from store or table when no one was at hand. I'm like a burglar that can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day, he thought. This is the dreariest and dullest part of all this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole, by my own warm fireside with the lamp shining. He often wished, too, that he could get a message for help sent to the wizard, but that, of course, was quite impossible, and he soon realized that if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins, alone and unaided. Eventually, after a week or two of this sneak-in sort of life, by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all their 12 selves in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way about very well. What was his surprise one day to overhear some of the guards talking and to learn that there was another dwarf in prison too, in a specially deep, dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that that was Thorin, and after a while he found that his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find the place when no one was about, and to have a word with the chief of the dwarves. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and was even beginning to think of telling the king all about his treasure and his quest, which shows how low-spirited he had become, when he heard Bilbo's little voice at his keyhole. He could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and he came to the door and had a long whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message to each of the other imprisoned dwarves, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also imprisoned close at hand, and that no one was to reveal their errand to the king, not yet, nor before Thorin gave the word. For Thorin had taken heart again, hearing how the hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of a share in the treasure until all hope of escaping it in any other way had disappeared, until in fact the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of whom he began to have a very high opinion indeed, had altogether failed to think of something clever. The other dwarves quite agreed when they got the message. They all thought their own shares in the treasure, which they quite regarded as theirs in spite of their plight and the still unconquered dragon, would suffer seriously if the wood elves claimed part of it, and they all trusted Bilbo. That was what Gandalf had said would happen, you see. Perhaps that was part of his reason for going off and leaving them. Fat chance. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly so hopeful as they did. He did not like being depended on by everyone, and he wished he had the wizard at hand. But that was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood lay between them. He sat and thought until his head nearly burst, but no bright idea would come. One invisible ring was a very fine thing, but it was not much good among poteen. But of course, as you have guessed, he did rescue his friends in the end, and this is how it happened. One day, nosing and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed under part of the lowest regions of the palace and joined the forest river some way further to the east, beyond the steep slope out of which the main mouth opened. Where this underground watercourse came forth from the hillside, there was a water gate. There the rocky roof came down close to the surface of the stream, and from it a portcullis could be dropped right to the bed of the river to prevent anyone coming in or out that way. But the portcullis was often open, for a good deal of traffic went out and in by the water gate. If anyone had come in that way, he would have found himself in a dark, rough tunnel leading deep into the heart of the hill, but at one point, where it passed under the caves, the roof had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. These opened upwards into the king's cellars. There stood barrels and barrels and barrels, for the wood elves, and especially their king, were very fond of wine, though no vines grew in those parts. The wine and other goods were brought from far away, from their kinsfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in distant lands. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered the trapdoors and their use, and lurking there, listening to the talk of the king's servants, he learned how the wine and other goods here came up the rivers, or overland to the long lake. It seemed a town of men still throve there, built out on bridges far into the water as a protection against enemies of all sorts, and especially against the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought up the forest river. Often they were just tied together, like big rafts, and pulled or rowed up the stream. Sometimes they were loaded onto flat boats. When the barrels were empty, the elves cast them through the trapdoors, opened a water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bobbing along, until they were carried by the current to a place far down the river where the bank jutted out near to the very eastern edge of Mirkwood. There they were collected and tied together and floated back to Lake Town, which stood close to the point where the forest river flowed into the long lake. For some time Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate, and wondered if it could be used for the escape of his friends, and at last he had the desperate beginnings of a plan. The evening meal had been taken to the prisoners. The guards were tramping away down the passages, taking the torchlight with them and leaving everything in darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief of the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that had just come. I shall be hard at work tonight clearing the cellars of the empty wood, so let us have a drink first to help the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. "I'll taste with you and see if it is fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and it would not do to send up poor stuff." When he heard this, Bilbo was all in a flutter, for he saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance at once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar and sat down at a table on which two large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo's end. It must be potent wine to make a wood elf drowsy, but this wine, it would seem, was the heady vintage of the great gardens of Darwinian, not meant for his soldiers or his servants, but for the king's feasts only, and for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon the chief guard nodded his head, then he laid it on the table and fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice, but soon his head too nodded to the table, and he fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then in crept the Hobbit. Very soon the chief guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passages towards the cells. The great bunch seemed very heavy to his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth, in spite of his ring, so he could not prevent the keys from making every now and then a loud clink and clank, which put him all in a tremble. First he unlocked Balin's door, and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad as he was to get out of his wearisome little stone room. He wanted to stop and ask questions and know what Bilbo was going to do and all about it. "No time now," said the hobbit. "You just follow me. We must all keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape or none, and this is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next, with chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue, there's a good fellow." Then off he went from door to door until his following had grown to 12. None of them any too nimble, what with the dark, and what with their long imprisonment. Bilbo's heart thumped every time one of them bumped into another, or grunted or whispered in the dark. "This dwarvish racket," he said to himself. But all went well, and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night, and in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were merrymaking. At last, after much blundering, they came to Thorin's dungeon, far down in a deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellar. "Upon my word," said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him to come out and join his friends, "Gandalf spoke true, as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make it seems. When the time comes, I am sure we are all forever at your service, whatever happens after this. But what comes next?" Bilbo saw that the time had come to explain his idea as far as he could, but he did not feel at all sure how the dwarves would take it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit, and started grumbling loudly in spite of their danger. "We shall be bruised and battered to pieces, and drowned too, for certain," they muttered. "We thought you had got some sensible notion when you managed to get hold of the keys. This is a mad idea." "Very well," said Bilbo, very downcast, and also rather annoyed. "Come on back to your nice cells, and I will lock you all in again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I shall ever get hold of the keys again, even if I feel inclined to try." That was too much for them, and they calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to do just what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find their way into the upper halls, or to find their way out of gates that closed by magic, and it was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So, following the hobbit down into the lowest cellars, they crept. They passed a door through which the chief guard and the butler could be seen, still happily snoring with smiles upon their faces. The wine of Dorvinion brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on the face of the chief guard next day, even though Bilbo, before they went on, stole in and kind-heartedly put the keys back on his belt. "That will save him some of the trouble he is in for," said Mr. Baggins to himself. "He wasn't a bad fellow, and quite decent to the prisoners. It will puzzle them all too. They will think we had a very strong magic to pass through all those locked doors and disappear. Disappear? We have got to get busy very quick if that is to happen." Balin was told off to watch the guard and the butler and give warning if they stirred. The rest went into the adjoining cellar with the trapdoors. There was little time to lose. Before long, as Bilbo knew, some elves were under orders to come down and help the butler get the empty barrels through the doors into the stream. These were, in fact, already standing in rows in the middle of the floor, waiting to be pushed off. Some of them were wine barrels, and these were not much use, as they could not easily be opened at the end without a deal of noise, nor could they easily be secured again. But among them were several others, which had been used for bringing other stuff, butter, apples, all sorts of things, to the king's palace. They soon found 13, with room enough for a dwarf in each. In fact, some were too roomy, and as they climbed in, the dwarves thought anxiously of the shaking and the bumping they would get inside, though Bilbo did his best to find straw and other stuff to pack them in as closely as would be managed in a short time. At last, 12 dwarves were stowed. Thorin had given a lot of trouble, and turned and twisted in his tub, and grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel, while Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about his air holes, and said he was stifling even before his lid was on. Bilbo had done what he could to close holes in the sides of the barrels and to fix on all the lids as safely as could be managed. And now he was left alone again, running round, putting the finishing touches to the backing, and hoping against hope that this plan would come off. It had not been done a bit too soon. Only a minute or two after Balin's lid had been fitted on, there came the sound of voices and the flicker of lights. A number of elves came laughing and talking into the cellars and singing snatches of song. They had left a merry feast in one of the halls and were bent on returning as soon as they could. "Where's old Gallion, the butler?" said one. "I haven't seen him in the stables tonight. He ought to be here now to show us what is to be done." "I shall be angry if the old slow coach is late," said another. "I have no wish to waste time down here while the song is up." came a cry. "Here's the old villain with his head on a jug. He's been having a little feast all to himself and his friend the captain." "Shake him, wake him," shouted the others impatiently. Gallin was not at all pleased at being shaken or wakened, and still less at being laughed at. "You're all late," he grumbled. "Here am I, waiting and waiting down here, while you fellows drink and make merry and forget your tasks. Small wonder if I fall asleep from weariness." "Small wonder," said they, "when the explanation stands close at hand in a jug. Come give us a taste of your sleeping draught before we fall." "Before we fall too?" "No need to wake the turnkey yonder. He has had his share by the looks of it." Then they drank once round and became mighty merry all of a sudden, but they did not quite lose their wits. "Save us, Gallion!" cried some. "You began your feasting early and muddled your wits. You have stacked some full casks here instead of the empty ones, if there is anything in wait." "Get on with the work," growled the butler. "There's nothing in the feeling of weight in an idle tosspot's arms. These are the ones to go and no others. Do as I say." Very well, they answered, rolling the barrels to the opening. "On your head be it, if the king's full butter tubs and his best wine is pushed into the river for the lakemen to feast on for nothing." Roll, 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 roll into the hole. Heave ho, splash, bump, dum they go, dum they bump. So they sang at first one barrel and then another, rumbled to the dark opening, and was pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Some were barrels really empty, and some were tubs neatly packed with a dwarf each, but down they all went, one after another, with many a clash and a bump, thudding on top of ones below, smacking into the water, jostling against the walls of the tunnel, knocking into one another, and bobbing away down the current. It was just at this moment that Bilbo suddenly discovered the weak point in his plan. Most likely saw it some time ago and have been laughing at him, but I don't suppose you would have done half as well yourselves in his place. Of course he was not in a barrel himself, nor was there anyone to back him in, even if there had been a chance. It looked as if he would certainly lose his friends this time. Nearly all of them had already disappeared through the dark trapdoor, and get utterly left behind and have to stay lurking as a permanent burglar in the elf caves forever. For even if he could have escaped through the upper gates at once, he had precious small chance of ever finding the dwarves again. He did not know the way by land to the place where the barrels were collected. He wondered what on earth would happen to them without him, for he had not had time to tell the dwarves all that he had learned, or what he had meant to do once they were out of the wood. While all these thoughts were passing through his mind, the elves, being very merry, began to sing a song round the river door. Some had already begun to haul on the ropes which pulled up the portcullis at the water gate, so as to let out the barrels as soon as they were all afloat below. I have heard like a version of this song today. I specifically searched for people who decided to put some music onto this particular song. So I'm just going to sing what I remember about that. It's not really a cover. What is it? Like an interpretation of Tolkien's poetry, I suppose. So, down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Live the halls and caverns deep, live the northern mountains steep, where the forest wide and dim stoops in shadows grey and grim. Float beyond the world of trees, out in the whispering breeze, past the rushes, past the reeds, past the marshes waving weeds, through the mist that raiseth white, up from mere and poor at night. All the stars that leap up the heavens cold and steep, turn when dawn comes over land, over rapid, over sand, south away and south away, take the sunlight and the day, back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and oxen feed. Back to gardens on the hills, where the berries swell and fills, under sunlight and light day, south away and south away, down the fifth dark term you go, back to lands you once did know. Sort of like that. So now, the very last barrel was being rolled to the doors. In despair, and not knowing what else to do, poor little Bilbo caught hold of it and was pushed over the edge with it. Down into the water he fell, splash, into the cold, dark water, with the barrel on top of him. He came up again, spluttering and clinging to the wood like a rat, but for all his efforts he could not scramble on top. Every time he tried, the barrel rolled round and ducked him under again. It was really empty and floated light as a cork. Though his ears were full of water, he could hear the elves still singing in the cellar above. Then suddenly the tramplers fell to with a boom, and their voices faded away. He was in the dark tunnel, floating in icy water, all alone, for you cannot count friends that are all packed up in barrels. Very soon a grey patch came in the darkness ahead. He heard the creak of the water gate being hauled up, and he found that he was in the midst of a bobbing and bumping mass of casks and tubs, all pressing together to pass under the arch and get out into the open stream. He had as much as he could do to prevent himself from being hustled and battered to bits, but at last the jostling crowd began to break up and swing off, one by one, onto the stony arch and away. Then he saw that it would have been no good even if he had managed to get astride his barrel, for there was no room to spare, not even for a hobbit, between its top and the suddenly stooping roof where the gate was. Out they went under the overhanging branches of the trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling, and whether a lot of water was getting into their tubs. Some of those that bobbed along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed that these had dwarves inside. I do hope I put the lids on tight enough, he thought, but before long he was worrying too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head above the water, but he was still shivering with the cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before the luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. The luck turned all right before long. The eddying currents carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and there for a while they stuck against some hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity of scrambling up the side of his barrel while it was held steady against another. Up he crawled like a drowned rat and lay on the top, spread out to keep the balance as best he could. The breeze was cold, but better than the water, and he hoped he would not suddenly roll off again when they started off once more. Before long the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted off down the stream and out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and being rather leaky, had now shipped a small amount of water. All the same, it was like trying to ride without bridle or stirrups a round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling on the grass. In this way, at last Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees on either hand grew thinner. He could see the paler sky between them. The dark river opened suddenly wide, and there it was joined to the main water of the forest river flowing down in haste from the king's great doors. There was a dim sheet of water, no longer overshadowed, and on its sliding surface there were dancing and broken reflections of clouds and of stars. Then the hurrying water of the forest river swept all the company of casks and tubs away to the north bank, in which it had eaten out a wide bay. This had a shingly shore under hanging banks, and was walled at the eastern end by a little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore, most of the barrels ran ground, though a few went on to bump against the stony pier. There were people on the lookout on the banks. They quickly pulled and pushed all the barrels together into the shallows, and when they had counted them, they roped them together and left them till the morning. Poor dwarves! Bilbo was not badly off now. He slipped from his barrel and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to some huts that he could see near the water's edge. He no longer thought twice about picking up a supper, and invited if he got the chance. He had been obliged to do it for so long, and he knew now only too well what it was to be really hungry, not merely politely interested in the dainties of a well-filled larder. Also, he had caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees, and that appealed to him with his dripping and ragged clothes clinging to him, cold and clammy. There is no need to tell you much of his adventures that night, for now we are drawing near the end of the eastward journey and coming to the last and greatest adventure, so we must hurry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, he got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the trail of drippings that he left wherever he went or sat. And also he began to snivel, and wherever he tried to hide, he was found out by the terrific explosions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon there was a fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods, carrying a loaf and a leather bottle of wine, and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had to pass wet as he was and far from a fire, but the bottle helped him to do that, and he actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, even though the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke again with a specially loud sneeze. It was already grey morning, and there was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up a raft of barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the stream to Lake Town. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he felt cold all over. He scrambled down as fast as his stiff legs would take him, and managed just in time to get on to the mass of casks without being noticed in the general bustle. Luckily there was no sun at the time to cast an awkward shadow, and for a mercy he did not sneeze again for a good while. There was a mighty pushing of poles. The elves that were standing in the shallow water heaved and shoved. The barrels now all lashed together and creaked and fretted. "This is a heavy load," some grumbled. "They float too deep. Some of these are never empty. If they had come ashore in the daylight, we might have had a look inside," they said. "No time now," cried the raftman. "Shove off!" And off they went at last, slowly at first, until they had passed the point of rock where other elves stood to fend them off with poles, and then quicker and quicker as they caught the main stream and went sailing away down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and were through the wood, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen. Well, finally out of Mirkwood, aren't we, lads? Honestly, what? At first, when Bilbo wandered off to get dry at a fire and steal some foods, I'm surprised. I was surprised. I mean, I realize now that these are elves, the people who are supposed to take the barrels even further down the river. But at first I thought he would just leave the dwarves. Why would he do that? I thought, get out of the barrels on your own. I don't care. I will not help you anymore. I'm gonna go get some food. Is that what he was thinking? I don't know. I like the song that the elves are singing, even though I have only heard two interpretations of it, but it is just so fun. And in the next chapter, or maybe in the chapter after that one, there will be another song, which I'm also going to do an interpretation of. I'm not sure if there is a similar one in English, but there was definitely one in my mother tongue from the fandom from this side. They definitely made a song out of the next one. So I'm just gonna put their music onto the English lyrics and see how well that holds up. I do not remember, though, what exactly happens in the next chapters, because there's still so much of the book. But, there should be a lake town, then the master of the lake, right? Then they all try to rob an armory, and then they all go by the river, right? Does nothing happen to Killy beforehand in the book? Because in the movie he gets injured when they escape Mirkwood, but here there's no fight, so he's not injured. I do not know if there's any drama in Lake Town at all. I mean, they must speak to Bard, right? I barely remember what Bard is like in the book. I honestly remember that I didn't even memorize his character when I first read the book. And then when the movies came out, I was genuinely surprised to see his character. Yeah, I never really cared much for him. Well, I mean, before the movies, probably. Now I can say that he's a good guy at least. And then they're in the mountain, right? They fight the dragon. Then we get a snippet of Thorin's gold sickness, and then the Battle of the Five Armies is like 1 page long. So what's the rest of the book about? Oh, sure, there's the journey back. Oh, I do not want to read that. That's going to be heartbreaking. Man, oh my god. Okay, so the next one is Lake Town, but I'm not sure if I should put up the illustration for it. I think I'd better. Here it is. Let's start the Lake Town chapter with the illustration of the Lake Town. So, chapter 10. A warm welcome. The day grew lighter and warmer as they floated along. After a while, the river rounded a steep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an inland cliff, the deepest stream had flowed lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away, the shores sank, the trees ended, then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes and pools dotted with isles on every side. But still, a strong water flowed on steadily through the midst, and far away, its dark head in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountain. Its nearest neighbors to the northeast and the tumbled land that joined it to them could not be seen. All alone it rose and looked across the marshes to the forest. The lonely mountain. Bilbo had come far and through many adventures to see it, and now he did not like the look of it in the least. As he listened to the talk of the raftmen and pieced together the scraps of information they let fall, he soon realized that he was very fortunate ever to have seen it at all, even from this distance. Dreary as had been his imprisonment and unpleasant as was his position, to say nothing of the poor dwarves underneath him, still he had been more lucky than he had guessed. The talk was all of the trade that came and went on the waterways and the growth of the traffic on the river as the roads out of the east towards Mirkwood vanished or fell into disuse, and of the bickerings of the lakemen and the wood elves about the upkeep of the forest river and the care of the banks. Those lands had changed much since the days when dwarves dwelt in the mountain, days which most people now remembered only as a very shadowy tradition. They had changed even in recent years, and since the last news that Gandalf had had of them. Great floods and rains had swollen the waters that flowed east, and there had been an earthquake or two, which some were inclined to attribute to the dragon, alluding to him chiefly with a curse and an ominous nod in the direction of the mountain. The marshes and bogs had spread wider and wider on either side. Paths had vanished, and many a rider and wanderer too, if they had tried to find the lost ways across. The elf rode through the wood, which the dwarves had followed on the advice of Beorn, now came to a doubtful and little used end at the eastern edge of the forest. Only the river offered any longer a safe way from the skirts of Mirkwood in the north to the mountain-shadowed plains beyond, and the river was guarded by the wood elves' king. So, you see, Bilbo had come in the end by the only road that was any good. It might have been some comfort to Mr. Baggins, shivering on the barrels, if he had known that news of this had reached Gandalf far away and given him great anxiety, and that he was in fact finishing his other business, which does not come into this tale, and getting ready to come in search of Thorin's company. But Bilbo did not know it. All he knew was that the river seemed to go on and on forever, and he was hungry and had a nasty cold in the nose and did not like the way the mountain seemed to frown at him and threaten him as it grew even nearer. After a while, however, the river took a more southerly course, and the mountain receded again, and at last, late in the day, the shores grew rocky, and the river gathered all its wandering waters together into a deep and rapid flood, and they swept along at great speed. The sun had set when, turning with another sweep towards the east, the forest river rushed into the long lake. There it had a wide mouth with stony cliff-like gates at either side, whose feet were piled with shingles. The long lake! Bilbo had never imagined that any water that was not the sea could look so big. It was so wide that the opposite shores looked small and far, that it was so long that its northerly end, which pointed towards the mountain, could not be seen at all. Only from the map did Bilbo know that away up there, where the stars of the Wine were already twinkling, the running river came down into the lake from Dale, and with the forest river filled with deep waters, what must once have been a great deep rocky valley. At the southern end, the doubled waters poured out again over high waterfalls and ran away hurriedly to unknown lands. In the still evening air, the noise of the falls could be heard like a distant roar. I'm going to break my tradition of not breaking up the flow of reading now, just to say, when I read this at first, I was surprised Bilbo finds the long lake so impressive, because my hometown is situated on the edge of a really large lake. Basically everywhere you go there, you cannot see the other shore unless you're at the very, very end of the lake, which is also very long, just like the long lake. So when you're at its thinnest part, you can see the other shore, but it's a really small part of it. Mostly, you just never see it. So yeah, he's really impressive then. Not far from the mouth of the forest river was the strange town he heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected from the swirl of the entering river by a promontory of rock which formed a calm bay. A great bridge made of wood ran out to where on huge piles made of forest trees was built a busy wooden town, not a town of elves, but of men, who still dared to dwell here under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. They still throve on the trade that came up the great river from the south and was carted past the falls to their town. But in the great days of old, when Dale in the north was rich and prosperous, they had been wealthy and powerful, and there had been fleets of boats on the waters, and some were filled with gold, and some with warriors in armor, and there had been wars and deeds which were now only a legend. Rotting piles of a greater town could still be seen along the shores when the water sank in a drought. But men remembered little of all that, though some still sang old songs of the dwarf kings of the mountain, Thror and Thrain, of the race of Durin, and of the coming of the dragon, and the fall of the Lords of Dale. Some sang too that Thror and Thrain would come back one day, and gold would flow in rivers through the mountain gates, and all that land would be filled with new song and new laughter. But this pleasant legend did not much affect their daily business. Finally, the illustration. As soon as the raft of barrels came in sight, boats rowed out from the piles of the town, and voices hailed the raft steerers. Then ropes were cast and oars were pulled, and soon the raft was drawn out of the current of the Forest River and towed away round the high shoulder of rock into the little bay of Laketown. There it was moored, not far from the shoreward head of the great bridge. Soon men would come up from the south and take some of the casks away, and others they would fill with goods they had brought to be taken back up the stream to the wood elves' home. In the meanwhile, the barrels were left afloat, while the elves of the raft and the boatmen went to feast in Laketown. They would have been surprised if they could have seen what happened down by the shore after they had gone and the shades of night had fallen. First of all, a barrel was cut loose by Bilbo and pushed to the shore and opened. Groans came from inside, and out crept a most unhappy dwarf. Wet straw was in his draggled beard. He was so sore and stiff, so bruised and buffeted, he could hardly stand or stumbled through the shallow water to lie groaning on the shore. He had a famished and a savage look, like a dog that has been chained and forgotten in a kennel for a week. It was Thorin, but you could only have told it by his golden chain and by the color of his now dirty and tattered sky-blue hood with its tarnished silver tassel. It was some time before he would be even polite to the Hobbit. "Well, are you alive or are you dead?" asked Bilbo quite crossly. Perhaps he had forgotten that he had had at least one good meal more than the dwarfs, and also the use of his arms and legs, not to speak of a greater allowance of air. "Are you still in prison, or are you free? If you want food, and if you want to go on with this silly adventure, it's yours after all, and not mine. You had better slap your arms and rub your legs and try to help me get the others out, while there is a chance." Thorin, of course, saw the sense of this. So after a few more groans, he got up and helped the Hobbit as well as he could. In the darkness, floundering in the cold water, they had a difficult and very nasty job of finding which were the right barrels. Knocking outside and calling out, only discovered about 6 dwarves that could answer. These were unpacked and helped ashore, where they sat or lay muttering and moaning. They were so soaked and bruised and cramped that they could hardly yet realize their release, or be properly thankful for it. Dwalin and Balin were 2 of the most unhappy, and it was no good asking them to help. Bifur and Bofur were less knocked about and drier, but they lay down and would do nothing. Fili and Kili, however, who were young for dwarves, and had also been packed more neatly with plenty of straw into smaller casks, came out more or less smiling, with only a bruise or 2 and a stiffness that soon wore off. "I hope I never smell the smell of apples again," said Fili. "My tub was full of it. To smell apples everlastingly when you can scarcely move and are cold and sick with hunger is maddening. I could eat anything in the wide world now for hours on end, but not an apple." With the willing help of Fili and Kili, Thorin and Bilbo at last discovered the remainder of the company and got them out. Poor fat Bombur was asleep or senseless. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were waterlogged and seemed only half alive. They all had to be carried one by one and laid helpless on the shore. "Well, here we are," said Thorin, "and I suppose we ought to thank our stars and Mr. Baggins. I am sure he has a right to expect it, though I wish he could have arranged a more comfortable journey. Still, all very much at your service once more, Mr. Baggins. No doubt we shall feel properly grateful when we are fed and recovered. In the meanwhile, what next?" "I suggest Laketown," said Bilbo. "What else is there?" Nothing else could, of course, be suggested, so Levin, the others, Thorin and Fili and Kili and the Hobbit, went along the shore to the great bridge. There were guards at the head of it, but they were not keeping very careful watch, for it was so long since there had been any real need. Except for occasional squabbles about river tolls, they were friends with the wood elves. Other folk were far away, and some of the younger people in the town openly doubted the existence of any dragon in the mountain, and laughed at the greybeards and gammas who said that they had seen him flying in the sky in their young days. That being so, it is not surprising that the guards were drinking and laughing by a fire in their hut, and did not hear the noise of the unpacking of the dwarves or the footsteps of the 4 scouts. Their astonishment was enormous when Thorin Oakenshield stepped in through the door. Who are you, and what do you want? They shouted, leaping to their feet and groping for weapons. Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain, said the dwarf in a loud voice, and he looked it, in spite of his torn clothes and draggled hood. The gold gleamed on his neck and waist. His eyes were dark and deep. I thought he had blue eyes. I have come back. I wish to see the master of your town. Then there was tremendous excitement. Some of the more foolish ran out of the hut as if they expected the mountain to go golden in the night and all the waters of the lake turn yellow right away. The captain of the guard came forward. And who are these? He asked, pointing to Fili, Kili, and Bilbo. The sons of my father's daughter, answered Thorin. Fili and Kili of the race of Durin, and Mr. Baggins, who has travelled with us out of the west. If you come in peace, lay down your arms, said the captain. We have none, said Thorin, and it was true enough. Their knives have been taken from them by the wood elves, and the great sword Orcrist too. Bilbo had his short sword hidden as usual, but he said nothing about that. We have no need of weapons, who return at last to our own, as spoken of old. Nor could we fight against so many. Take us to your master. He's at feast, said the captain. Then all the more reason for taking us to him, burst in Fili, who was getting impatient at these solemnities. We have worn and famished after a long road, and we have sick comrades. Now make haste, and let us have no more words, or your master may have something to say to you. Follow me then, said the captain, and with 6 men about them, he led them over the bridge, through the gates, and into the marketplace of the town. This was a wide circle of quiet water, surrounded by the tall piles on which were built the greater houses, and by long wooden quays with many steps and ladders going down to the surface of the lake. From one great hall shone many lights, and there came the sound of many voices. They passed its doors and stood blinking in the light, looking at long tables filled with folk. I am Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, king under the mountain. I return, cried Thorin in a loud voice from the door, before the captain could say anything. All leaped to their feet. The master of the town sprang from his great chair, but none rose in greater surprise than the raftmen of the elves, who were sitting at the lower end of the hall. Pressing forward before the master's table, they cried, These are prisoners of our king that have escaped, wandering vagabond dwarves that could not give any good account of themselves, sneaking through the woods and molesting our people. Is this true? Asked the master. As a matter of fact, he thought it far more likely than the return of the king into the mountain, if any such person had ever existed. It is true that we were wrongfully waylaid by the Elven King and imprisoned without cause as we journeyed back to our own land, answered Thorin. But lock nor bar may hinder the homecoming spoken of old. Nor is this town in the Wood Elves' realm. I speak to the master of the town, of the men of the lake, not to the raftmen of the king. Then the master hesitated and looked from one to the other. The Elven King was very powerful in those parts, and the master wished for no enmity with him, nor did he think much of old songs, giving his mind to trade and tolls, to cargoes and gold, to which habit he owed his position. Others were of different mind, however, and quickly the matter was settled without him. The news had spread from the doors of the hall like fire through all the town. People were shouting inside the hall and outside it. The quays were thronged with hurrying feet. Some began to sing snatches of old songs concerning the return of the king and the mountain, that it was Thror's grandson, not Thror himself, that had come back, did not bother them at all. Others took up the song, and it rolled loud and high over the lake. The king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone, the lord of silver fountains shall come into his own. His crown shall be upholden, his harp shall be restrung. His halls shall echo golden till songs of yore is sung. The woods shall wave on mountains and grass beneath the sun. His wells shall flow in fountains and the rivers golden run. The streams shall run in gladness, the lake shall shine and burn. All sorrow fell at sadness at the mountain king's return. So they sang, or very like that, only there was a great deal more of it, and there was much shouting, as well as the music of harps and of fiddles mixed up with it. Indeed, such excitement had not been known in the town in the memory of the oldest grandfather. The wood elves themselves began to wonder greatly, and even to be afraid. They did not know, of course, how Thorin had escaped, and they began to think their king might have made a serious mistake. As for the maker, the master, he saw there was nothing else for it but to obey the general clamour, for the moment at any rate, and to pretend to believe that Thorin was what he said. So he gave up to him his own great chair, and set Fili and Kili beside him in places of honour. Even Bilbo was given a seat at the high table, and no explanation of where he came in, no songs had alluded to him, even in the obscurest way, was asked for in the general bustle. Soon afterwards, the other dwarfs were brought into the town amid scenes of astonishing enthusiasm. They were all doctored and fed and housed and pampered in the most delightful and satisfactory fashion. A large house was given up to Thorin and his company, boats and rowers were put at their service, and crowds sat outside and sang songs all day, or cheered if any dwarf showed so much as his nose. Some of the songs were old ones, but some of them were quite new, and spoke confidently of the sudden death of the dragon and of cargoes of rich presents coming down the river to Lake Town. These were inspired largely by the master, and they did not particularly please the dwarfs, but in the meantime they were well contented, and they quickly grew fat and strong again. Indeed, within a week they were quite recovered, fitted out in fine cloth of their proper colours, with beards combed and trimmed, and proud steps. Thorin looked and walked as if his kingdom was already regained, and Smaug chopped up into little pieces. Then, as he had said, the dwarf's good feeling towards the little hobbit grew stronger every day. There were no more groans or grumbles. They drank his health, and they patted him on the back, and they made a great fuss on him, which was just as well, for he was not feeling particularly cheerful. He had not forgotten the look of the mountain, nor the thought of the dragon, and he had, besides, a shocking cold. For 3 days he sneezed and coughed, and he could not go out, and even after that his speeches at banquets were limited to "Thank you very much." In the meantime, the wood elves had gone back up the forest river with their cargoes, and there was great excitement in the king's palace. I have never heard what happened to the chief of the guards and the butler. Nothing, of course, was ever said about keys or barrels while the dwarfs stayed in Lake Town, and Bilbo was careful never to become invisible. Still, I dare say more was guessed than was known, though doubtless Mr. Baggins remained a bit of a mystery. In any case, the king knew now that dwarves aren't, or thought he did, and he said to himself, "Very well, we'll see. No treasure will come back through Mirkwood without my having something to say in the matter. But I expect they will all come to a bad end, and serve them right." He, at any rate, did not believe in dwarfs fighting and killing dragons like Smaug, and he strongly suspected attempted burglary or something like it, which shows he was a wise elf, and wiser than the men of the town, though not quite right, as we shall see in the end. He sent out his spies about the shores of the lake and as far northward towards the mountain as they would go, and waited. At the end of a fortnight, Thorin began to think of departure. While the enthusiasm still lasted in the town, was the time to get help. It would not do to let everything cool down with delay. So he spoke to the master and his councillors and said that soon he and his company must go on towards the mountain. Then for the first time the master was surprised and a little frightened, and he wondered if Thorin was after all really a descendant of the old kings. He had never thought that the dwarves would actually dare to go to approach Smaug, but believed they were frauds who would sooner or later be discovered and be turned out. He was wrong. Thorin, of course, was really the grandson of the king under the mountain, and there is no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge or the recovery of his own. But the master was not sorry at all to let them go. They were expensive to keep, and their arrival had turned things into a long holiday in which business was at a standstill. "Let them go and bother Smaug, and see how he welcomes them," he thought. "Certainly of Thorin Thrain's son's Thror's son," was what he said. "You must claim your own. The hour is at hand, spoken of old. What help we can offer shall be yours, and we trust to your gratitude when your kingdom is regained." So one day, although autumn was now getting far on, and winds were cold and leaves were falling fast, 3 large boats left Laketown, laden with rowers, dwarves, Mr. Baggins, and many provisions. Horses and ponies had been sent round by circuitous paths to meet them at their appointed landing place. The master and his councillors bade them farewell. From the great steps of the town hall that went down to the lake, people sang of the quays, and out of windows the white oars dipped and splashed, and off they went north up the lake on the last stage of their long journey. The only person thoroughly unhappy was Bilbo. Now, should we read the next chapter? I'm not sure if there are any pictures in the next chapter, because honestly, I thought that it would take longer. But I can't see how long the next chapter is. It doesn't look too long, and there are no songs in it. And there is a picture in my edition of the front gate. Let me see if there's any picture like that in this edition. Surely there should be one. Oh yes. Oh no, this is not the front gate at all. Oh, unfortunate it is. The front gate really does look very beautiful. But I suppose you won't see it here, because I'm not just looking for one illustration for a stream of reading. That would be ridiculous. However, yes, we can do the next chapter. Laketown was so small. I can't help but keep wondering what happens next, because there's just so much text left. And I thought that the bulk of the adventure is supposed to be in Mirkwood and like here, and there's nothing. I am genuinely surprised at that development. Oh well, what will we do? Chapter 11, on the doorstep. In 2 days, Gawain there rode right up the long lake and passed out into the river running. and now they could all see the lonely mountain towering grim and tall before them. The stream was strong, and they were going slow. At the end of the third day, some miles up the river, they drew into the left of western bank and disembarked. Here they were joined by the horses with other provisions and necessaries, and the ponies for their own use that had been sent to meet them. They packed what they could on the ponies, and the rest was made into a store under a tent, but none of the men of the town would stay with them, even for the night, so near the shadow of the mountain. I suppose we can get rid of the illustration for Lake Town and pull up the map again. Let's go. Here. We are at Esgaroth, here. And we're leaving north for Dale. Will it not stop here? In the middle, here. Why does it keep going west? Okay. Well, I suppose this should be it. Moving on. Not at any rate until the songs have come true, said they. It was easier to believe in the dragon and less easy to believe in Thorin in these wild parts. Indeed, their stores had no need of any guard, for all the land was desolate and empty. So their escort left them, making off swiftly down the river and the shoreward paths, although the night was already drawing on. They spent a cold and lonely night, and their spirits fell. The next day they set out again. Balin and Bilbo rode behind, each leading another pony heavily laden beside him. The others were some way ahead, picking out a slow road where there were no paths. They made northwest, slanting away from the river running, and drawing ever nearer and nearer to a great spur of the mountain that was flung out southward towards them. It was a weary journey, and a quiet and stealthy one. There was no laughter, or song, or sound of harps, and the pride and hopes which had stirred in their hearts at the singing of old songs by the lake died away to a plodding gloom. They knew that they were drawing near to the end of their journey, and that it might be a very horrible end. The land about them grew bleak and barren, though once, as Thorin told them, it had been green and fair. There was little grass, and before long there was neither bush nor tree, and only broken and blackened stumps, to speak of ones long vanished. They were come to the desolation of the dragon, and they were come at the waning of the year. They reached the skirts of the mountain, all the same without meeting any danger or any sign of the dragon other than the wilderness he had made about his lair. The mountain lay dark and silent before them, and ever higher above them. They made their first camp on the western side of the great southern spur, which ended in a height called Ravenhill. Oh, Ravenhill! On this there had been an old watch-post, but they dared not climb it yet. It was too exposed. Before setting out to search the western spurs of the mountain for the hidden door, on which all their hopes rested, Thorin sent out a scouting expedition to spy out the land to the south, where the front gate stood. For this purpose he chose Balin and Finn and Kili, and with them went Bilbo. They marched under the grey and silent cliffs to the feet of Ravenhill. There the river, after winding a wide loop over the valley of Dale, turned from the mountain on its road to the lake, flowing swift and noisily. Its bank was bare and rocky, tall and steep above the stream, and gazing out from it over the narrow water, foaming and splashing among many boulders, they could see in the wide valley, shadowed by the mountain's arms, the grey ruins of ancient houses, towers, and walls. "There lies all that is left of Dale," said Balin. The mountain sides were green with woods, and all the sheltered valley rich and pleasant in the days when the bells rang in that town. He looked both sad and grim as he said this. He had been one of Thorin's companions on the day the dragon came. They did not dare to follow the river much further towards the gate. They went on beyond the end of the southern spur until, lying hidden behind a rock, they could look out and see the dark cavernous opening in a great cliff wall between the arms of the mountain. Out of it the waters of the running river sprang, and out of it too there came a steam and a dark smoke. Nothing moved in the waste, save the vapour in the water, and every now and again a black and ominous crow. The only sound was the sound of the stony water, and every now and again the harsh croak of a bird. Balin shuddered. "Let us return," he said. "We can do no good here, and I don't like these dark birds. They look like spies of evil." "Oh, here it is! After all, this is the front gate. I wonder why it was not labelled correctly. We shall put it right next to us." Just let me first do this correctly. So this is here. Let's move it next here so that I can not obscure it with the illustration when I pull it up. I will obscure some of the drawing stream, I suppose, with it. Only a little bit though. Only a little bit. Here we go. This can work, can it? It sort of works, I suppose. It really obscures the map though. We should pull up the map maybe like here. Yes, so that we can see both Erebor and the illustration and the text. Yeah, that looks like it works. So where did we end? Oh, at evil. Right, of course. So, the dragon is still alive, and in the halls under the mountain then. Well, I imagine so from the smoke, said the Hobbit. That does not prove it, said Balin, though I don't doubt you are right. He might be gone away sometime, or he might be lying out on the mountainside keeping watch, and still I expect smokes and steams would come out of the gates. All the halls within must be filled with his foul reek. Such gloomy thoughts, followed ever by croaking crows above them, they made their weary way back to the camp. Only in June they had been guests in the fair house of Elrond, and though autumn was now crawling toward winter, that pleasant time now seemed years ago. They were alone in the perilous waste without hope of further help. They were at the end of their journey, but as far as ever it seemed from the end of their quest. None of them had much spirit left. Now, strange to say, Mr. Baggins had more than the others. He would often borrow Thorin's map and gaze at it, pondering over the runes and the message of the moon letters Elrond had read. It was he that made the dwarves begin the dangerous search on the western slopes for the secret door. They moved their camp then to a long valley, narrower than the great dale in the south, where the gates of the river stood, and walled with lower spurs of the mountain. Two of these here thrust forward west from the main mass in long, steep-sided ridges that fell ever downwards towards the plain. On this western side there were fewer signs of the dragon's marauding feet, and there was some grass for their ponies. From this western camp, shadowed all day by cliff and wall until the sun began to sink towards the forest, day by day they toiled in parties, searching for paths up the mountainside. If the map was true, somewhere high above the cliff, at the valley's head, must stand the secret door. Day by day they came back to their camp without success. But at last, unexpectedly, they found what they were seeking. Philly and Killy and the Hobbit went back one day down the valley and scrambled among the tumbled rocks at its southern corner. But midday, creeping behind a great stone that stood alone like a pillar, Bilbo came on what looked like rough steps going upwards. Following these excitedly, he and the dwarfs found traces of a narrow track, often lost, often rediscovered, that wandered on to the top of the southern ridge and brought them at last to a still narrower ledge which turned north across the face of the mountain. Looking down, they saw that they were at the top of the cliff and the valley's head, and were gazing down onto their own camp below. Silently clinging to the rocky wall on their right, they went in single file along the ledge till the wall opened, and they turned into a little steep-walled bay, grassy-floored, still and quiet. Its entrance, which they had found, could not be seen from below because of the overhang of the cliff, nor from further off because it was so small that it looked like a dark crack, and no more. It was not a cave, and was open to the sky above, but at its inner end a flat wall rose up that in the lower part, close to the ground, was as smooth, as upright as mason's work, but without joint or crevice to be seen. No sign was there of post or lintel or threshold, nor any sign of bar or bolt or keyhole, yet they did not doubt that they had found the door at last. They beat on it, they thrust and pushed at it, they implored it to move, and spoke fragments of broken spells of opening, but nothing stirred. At last, tired out, they rested on the grass at its feet, and then at evening began their long climb down. There was excitement in the camp that night. In the morning they prepared to move once more. Only Boffer and Bombur were left behind to guard the ponies and such stores as they had brought with them from the river. The others went down the valley and up the newly found path, and so to the narrow ledge. Along this they could carry no bundles or packs, so narrow and breathless was it, with a fall of 150 feet beside them on to sharp rocks below, but each of them took a good coil of rope wound tight about his waist, and so at last without mishap they reached the little grassy bay. There they made their third camp, hauling up what they needed from below their ropes. Down the same way they were able occasionally to lower one of the more active dwarfs, such as Killy, to exchange such news as there was, or to take a share in the guard below, while Bofur was hauled up to the higher camp. Bombur would not come up either the rope or the bath. "I am too fat for such fly walks," he said. "I should turn dizzy and tread on my beard, and then you would be 13 again, and the knotted ropes are too slender for my weight." Luckily for him, that was not true, as you will see. In the meanwhile, some of them explored the ledge beyond the opening and found a path that led higher and higher onto the mountain, but they did not dare to venture very far that way, nor was there much use in it. Out up there, silence reigned, broken by no bird or sound except that of the wind in the crannies of stone. They spoke low, and never called or sang, for danger brooded in every rock. The others, who were busy with the secret of the door, had no more success. They were too eager to trouble about the runes or the moon letters, but tried without resting to discover where exactly in the smooth base of the rock the door was hidden. They had brought picks and tools of many sorts from Laketown, and at first they tried to use these. But when they struck the stone, the handles splintered and jarred the arms cruelly, and the steel heads broke or bent like lead. Mining work, they saw clearly, was no good against the magic that had shut this door, and they grew terrified too of the echoing noise. Bilbo found sitting on the doorstep lonesome and wearisome. There was not a doorstep, of course, really, but they used to call the little grassy space between the wall and the opening the doorstep in fun, remembering Bilbo's words long ago at the unexpected party in his hobbit hole when he said they could sit on the doorstep till they thought of something. and sit and think they did, or wandered aimlessly about, and glummer and glummer they became. Their spirits had risen a little at the discovery of the path, but now they sank into their boots, and yet they would not give it up and go away. The Hobbit was no longer much brighter than the dwarfs. He would do nothing but sit with his back to the rock face and stare away west through the opening, over the cliff, over the wide lands to the black wall of Mirkwood, and to the distances beyond, in which he sometimes thought he could catch glimpses of the Misty Mountain, small and far. If the dwarfs asked him what he was doing, he answered, "You said sitting on the doorstep and thinking would be my job, not to mention getting inside, so I am sitting and thinking." But I am afraid he was not thinking much of the job, but of what lay beyond the blue distance, the quiet western land, and the hill, and his hobbit hole under it. A large grey stone lay in the centre of the grass, and he stared moodily at it, or watched the great snails. They seemed to love the little shut-in bay with its walls of cool rock, and there were many of them of huge size crawling slowly and stickily along its sides. "Tomorrow begins the last week of autumn," said Thorin one day. "And winter comes after autumn," said Bifur. "And next year after that," said Dwalin. "And our beards will grow till they hang down the cliff to the valley before anything happens here. What is our burglar doing for us? Since he has got an invisible ring, and ought to be a specially excellent performer now, I am beginning to think he might go through the front gate and spy things out a bit." Bilbo heard this. The dwarves were on the rocks just above the enclosure where he was sitting, and good gracious, he thought. So that is why they are beginning to think, is it? It is always poor me that has to get them out of their difficulties, at least since the wizard left. Whatever am I going to do? I might have known that something dreadful would happen to me in the end. I don't think I could bear to see the unhappy Valley of Dale again, and as for that steaming gate... That night he was very miserable, and hardly slept. Next day the dwarfs all went wandering off in various directions. Some were exercising the ponies down below, some were roving about the mountainside. Old Abel was sat gloomily in the grassy bay, gazing at the stone, or out west through the narrow opening. He had a queer feeling that he was waiting for something. Perhaps the wizard will suddenly come back today, he thought. If he lifted his head, he could see a glimpse of the distant forest. As the sun turned west, there was a gleam of yellow upon its far roof, as if the light caught the last pale leaf. Soon he saw the orange ball of the sun sinking towards the level of his eyes. He went to the opening, and there, pale and faint, was a thin new moon above the rim of earth. At that very moment he heard a sharp crack behind him. There, on the grey stone, in the grass, was an enormous thrush, nearly a coal black, its pale yellow breast freckled with dark spots. Crack! It had caught a snail and was knocking it on the stone. Crack, crack! Suddenly Bilbo understood. Forgetting all danger, he stood on the ledge and hailed the dwarfs, shouting and waving. Those that were nearest came tumbling over the rocks, and as fast as they could along the ledge to him, wondering what on earth was the matter. The others shouted to be hauled up the ropes, except Bombur, of course. He was asleep. Quickly Bilbo explained. They all fell silent, the hobbit standing by the grey stone, and the dwarfs with wagging beards watching impatiently. The sun sank lower and lower, and their hopes fell. It sank into a belt of reddened cloud and disappeared. The dwarfs groaned, but still Bilbo stood almost without moving. The little moon was dipping to the horizon. Evening was coming on. Then suddenly, when their hope was lowest, a red ray of the sun escaped like a finger through a rent in the cloud. A gleam of light came straight through the opening into the bay and fell on the smooth rock face. The old thrush, who had been watching from a high perch, with beady eyes and a head cocked on one side, gave a sudden thrill. There was a loud crack, a flake of rock split from the wall and fell. The hole appeared suddenly, about 3 feet from the ground. Quickly trembling, lest the chance should fade, the dwarfs rushed to the rock and pushed. In vain. The key! The key! cried Bilbo. Where is Thorin? Thorin hurried up. The key! shouted Bilbo. The key that went with the map. Try it now while there is still time. Then Thorin stepped up and drew the key on its chain from round his neck. He put it to the hole, it fitted, and it turned. Snap! The gleam went out, the sun sank, the moon was gone, and evening sprang into the sky. Now they all pushed together, and slowly a part of the rock wall gave way. Long straight cracks appeared and widened. A door 5 feet high and 3 broad was outlined, and slowly, without a sound, swung inwards. It seemed as if darkness flowed out like a vapor from the hole in the mountainside, and deep darkness in which nothing could be seen lay before their eyes, a yawning mouth leading in and down. All right, well, I do not know if my throat can carry on much longer, but this was sort of underwhelming. I cannot stop comparing the book and the movie because they're just such perfect additions to each other. I like that the movie explores the characters of the dwarves a bit more and gives them a bit more action. Like this one chapter just here, it feels really, really, really underwhelming because I can't help but compare it to this desperate hopelessness that the dwarves feel in the movie when the last sun ray does not reveal the door, and then Bilbo still waits, and the moon does. I honestly expected this to also be the case here in the book. It must have been way too long since I last read it because I didn't remember that it was not the case at all. I must confess, I much prefer the movie version in this scene specifically because it's just so emotional. And I don't agree with the film scene though, because I do not think that Thorin would have given up so quickly, but that's just my interpretation of his character and not really facts or anything that I would like to know for sure. Even so, it was heartbreaking to see them leaving. And I remember when watching for the first time in the movies, well, in the theaters, when it came out as a movie, I mean, I genuinely felt fear for the company. I thought, oh, what if they really do not find the door? Maybe they will have some other way to enter the mountain and have some other adventure or whatever else. But no, they did. They did find the door in the end. It was just emotional. I do not know what other word to use here. Anyway, I suppose this should be the end. Would you like to draw us an ending picture, dear? Oh, the key. I also am conflicted about the way the dwarves are portrayed in the original story, I mean in the book, because there's way too much laughter, I don't know, cruelty and jeering at, for example, Bomber's weight, or just some other negative traits of the dwarves, like their grouchiness. Although that one is at least, well, funny, relatively funny. And there's way too little personality for them. Like Bomber's whole personality is he's fat and apparently lazy or whatever. Like he only sleeps and eats. Why is he in the company at all if he's so terrible, Mr. Tolkien? Can you please tell me? I don't think he thought too much about them. which is why I am really appreciative of the movie. Thank you, PJ, for thinking of the dwarf's personality. I do not know how I would have reread the story otherwise. I mean, I would, but I would not love it so much. I really love the whole company and all of them. All their different characters, different countenances. I do not know what other words to apply here. They're just so distinct, right? They have their distinct traits that make them stand out. And here it's more of a mass of just whomever they could be. It's like dwarves plural as a mass, as people, and not dwarves, but several singular ones. You know what I mean? I think I start rambling. Is that supposed to be Bilbo with the key? Why is Bilbo holding the key, darling? Is this supposed to be Thorin? No? Very angry Bilbo with the key? Ah, that is a yes. Okay. Okay. Oh well. Alrighty. Let's see. The Thorin gave Bilbo the key and Bilbo's angry now. It's like, the key, Thorin. The key's in your hands, Bilbo. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming to the stream, although most of those people who have come at the beginning have already left. And thank you for the people who are watching this in the recording. I also changed the audio a little bit, so I hope that this is better than the previous ones, but we'll see. In a couple days there should be better equipment, so maybe I'll sound a bit, well, less ear-shattering. Either way, please do give the artist a follow in her Telegram channel and TikTok, which I am linking in the description. You can also follow me, but that is not required. However, do come again to read the next chapters of The Hobbit. Next time we are moving into the mountain. It's actually a great place to stop, isn't it? Because next time we're starting the next chunk of the journey, which is the mountain itself, the Battle of Smaug. I think there will be like 2 more streams maybe to finish off this book, and then we'll move on to the Lord of the Rings. I'm already thinking of reading Concerning Hobbits just for the whole stream. That will probably come to life. Anyway, thank you again, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.